Okay, so this all happened a few years ago when I was in university. I've never told anyone about it, except my close friends who were there with me. Honestly, I don't even know if I'm ready to put this out there, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone will believe me. Or maybe they'll think I'm crazy. Whatever. My name is Carlos, and I was in my third year at a university in Mexico City, studying film. I was always into making short films and documentaries, and for one of my projects, I needed to do something unique. You know, something that would stand out. I'd heard about this abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of the city, a place where people said strange things happened. It had been shut down for decades, and there were all kinds of stories about what went down in there. Some people claimed the doctors did experiments on the patients, and others said people just vanished from the place, like they were swallowed by the walls. Of course, being young and stupid, I thought it would make an awesome subject for my project. So I convinced a few of my friends to help me out. Luis was my cameraman, and he was always down for stuff like this, though he got scared pretty easily. Javier, our sound guy, liked to act like he didn't believe in any of the supernatural stuff, but I could tell he was nervous. And then there was Mariela. She wasn't even part of the project, but she came along because she was really into the whole ghost hunting thing. She knew a lot about the history of the hospital and kept talking about how it was haunted by the spirits of patients who died there. We decided to go late in the afternoon, hoping we'd get some cool footage just as the sun was setting. The hospital was hidden behind a bunch of overgrown trees, and honestly, the place was falling apart. There was graffiti all over the walls, windows smashed out, and doors hanging off their hinges. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd expect to find in a horror movie. The first thing that hit me was how quiet it was. Even though we were near the outskirts of the city, there was no noise, no cars, no birds, nothing. Just this eerie silence that immediately made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off because, well, I didn't want to freak myself out before we even started. Mariela was the most excited out of all of us. She kept going on about how there were reports of people hearing strange noises in the hospital that night. Footsteps, doors slamming, whispers in the dark. I just laughed and told her she'd been watching too many horror movies, but part of me couldn't help but feel a little unsettled. We walked inside and the smell hit me right away, like mildew and rot. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and old hospital beds were scattered around, rusting and covered in dust. There were even old patient files lying around, but most of them were torn up or too faded to read. It was creepy, sure, but at that point, it just felt like we were exploring an old building. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We started filming in the main hallway, and things were going pretty well at first. Luis was setting up the camera and Javier was messing with the sound equipment. Meanwhile, Mariela was wandering off, checking out the rooms. I called out to her to stay close, but she just waved me off. I figured she was fine, so I didn't push it. Then, weird stuff started happening. At first, it was small things. Luis kept complaining that his camera wasn't focusing right, even though it had been working fine outside. He said the screen would glitch and show weird static, almost like there was interference, but there was no power in the building. Javier was picking up strange noises on his sound recorder, like distant voices, but when we listened back, it was all garbled and too faint to make out. I tried to play it cool, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. I mean, yeah, it was an old building, and maybe the equipment was acting up because of that, but it felt like there was something more. Like we weren't alone. That's when Mariela came back to us, and I could tell something had freaked her out. She said she found a room at the end of the hall that didn't look like it had been touched in years. The rest of the hospital was trashed, but she swore this room looked almost new, like someone had been there recently. Of course, we had to check it out. We walked down the hall, and the temperature dropped. I'm not even kidding. It was like stepping into a freezer. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. My heart was racing, and I could tell the others felt it too, but nobody said anything. We reached the door and Mariela was right. It was different. There wasn't any graffiti, No broken windows, no dust, just a single bed with restraints. Like the kind they use in psychiatric hospitals to keep patients from hurting themselves. And in the corner, there was this old, rusty wheelchair. The second we stepped into that room, everything changed. The door slammed shut behind us and the temperature dropped even more. Luis freaked out and ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like it was stuck, or like something was holding it shut. Javier was trying to record everything, but his equipment just went dead. No sound, no static, nothing. And then we heard it, a faint whisper. At first, it was so soft that I thought I was imagining it, but then it got louder. We couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like it was coming from all around us. Luis was panicking, banging on the door, trying to get out. Javier just stood there, staring at the bed like he was in a trance. And Mariela, she was the worst. She was standing in the middle of the room, staring at something we couldn't see. I grabbed her arm and tried to pull her towards the door, but she wouldn't move. She kept whispering something under her breath. And when I finally got close enough to hear, she was saying, "It's here. It's here." Before I could ask her what she meant, something grabbed her. Now, I know how that sounds. I know you probably don't believe me, but I swear to God, something invisible grabbed her and yanked her backward toward the bed. She screamed, and we all rushed to help her, but it was like she was being pulled by some force we couldn't see. Her body was lifted off the ground, and she was thrashing around, trying to break free, but whatever had her wasn't letting go. Then, just like that, something yanked her across the floor. 1 second she was standing there, and the next she was being dragged backward, like something was pulling her by the arms. But there was no one there. She screamed, her fingers clawing at the ground, trying to get a grip on the floor, but it was no use. We tried to grab her, but we couldn't get to her in time. She was dragged out of the room and into the dark hallway beyond, her body disappearing around the corner. We ran after her, but when we reached the hallway, she was completely gone. The place was completely silent. We searched everywhere, every room, every corner, but there was no trace of her. It was like she had been pulled into another part of the hospital, somewhere we couldn't reach, somewhere we couldn't find. Luis and Javier were in shock. We didn't know what to do. We couldn't explain what happened, and we were too scared to stay in that place any longer. We ran out of that hospital and didn't stop until we got back into the car. Yeah, we did go to the police. They didn't believe us. They thought we were messing around or trying to pull some kind of prank. They did search the hospital, but found nothing. No sign of Mariela. No sign of any struggle. Nothing. To this day, she's still missing. I don't know what took her. I don't even want to know. But I'll never forget the look on her face as she was pulled away. And I'll never step foot in that hospital again. A few years ago, I was studying medicine and I had the opportunity to do an internship at a small private psychiatric hospital for elderly adults. Once a week, as an incentive, we would give the patients candy or some treats. One day, one of them asked me why we didn't give candy to the children who played in the yard. Even though I was just an intern, I knew for sure that there were no children in the hospital, as it was a private facility. No visitors were allowed without an appointment, let alone minors. And there was no children's area in the hospital. At first, I thought it was part of his illness, but then I overheard a nurse talking about these children. She mentioned that they appeared to patients who were close to death. I decided to ignore the comment since I didn't believe in the paranormal. One night, after my shift ended, sometime after midnight, I was gathering my things when my last cigarette fell out of my bag. I found it strange because cigarettes are fragile and I usually take care to store them properly. I figured it was just an oversight and didn't pay much attention to the detail. I wanted to leave, and being alone in the locker room gave me the creeps. As I said, I didn't believe in stories, but whenever I was alone in any area of the hospital, I felt like I was being watched. I realized I didn't have my lighter. I wanted to smoke on my way to the taxi stop, so I asked my coworkers if anyone had a lighter I could borrow. They said no, but one of them suggested I use the lighter in the communal kitchen. I hesitated for a moment because it meant going back into the hospital, alone, and walking through the hallways. Most of my coworkers had already left. I had thought about asking one of the remaining coworkers to come with me, but I didn't want them to think that I was scared, even though I was a little. In the end, I mustered up the courage and went back to the kitchen. My desire to smoke outweighed my fear. I crossed the hallways on the ground floor toward the back of the hospital. Halfway there, near the stairs, I saw the shadow of a child-sized figure run down the stairs and through the door of the room across from the stairs. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination or fear playing tricks on me. I made my way to the kitchen, grabbed the lighter, and almost ran out. By the time I got outside, my coworkers had already left. I lit my cigarette, which calmed me down a bit, got into a taxi, and asked the driver if he believed in ghost stories. He told me that when he first moved to the city, the house he rented had a spirit that tormented them day and night. They eventually brought in a priest to bless the house, and the spirit left them alone. I got home still thinking about the shadow I had seen in the hospital. I decided to find the nurse who had talked about the children. I had a light dinner. I tried to sleep, but tossed and turned all night. The next day, I woke up not wanting to go to the hospital. I even considered calling in sick, but I didn't. I washed my face and went to work. I arrived as usual, clocked in, and greeted my coworkers. They seemed downcast, and when I asked why, they told me that the patient in the room across from the stairs on the ground floor had passed away during the night. A chill ran down my spine. It was the door where I had seen the shadow enter. Apparently, I had gone pale because a coworker asked me if something was wrong, if I felt okay. I laughed nervously and told him everything was fine. I went upstairs to find the nurse who had mentioned the children. She would have answers. I saw her talking to another nurse, and as politely as I could, I told her I needed to speak with her. We stepped aside, and I told her what I had seen the night before, and also that the patient had died. She became serious and told me she had heard the stories, but didn't think they were real. She recounted that when she first started working at the hospital, one of her patients told her that one of the children had visited her. The night the patient had a heart attack, which she miraculously survived, a girl of about 6 years old with a disfigured face, as if she had suffered severe burns, visited her. The girl told her it was time to go with her, that it was her time. The patient asked why the girl hadn't crossed over, and the girl told her that no one had come for them. She explained that they believed if they guided the elderly to the other side, they would one day be able to pass through themselves. With a sad look, the nurse told me that only those who are about to die see the children, and that my days were likely numbered. I felt a knot in my stomach and walked away without saying anything as panic grew inside me. I tried to get through the day without thinking about it, but it was impossible. I managed to finish my shift, though I made several mistakes due to my distractions. Even my boss asked me if I was feeling well, and I told him I wasn't, thinking I could use it as an excuse to take the next day off. I didn't want to go back to the hospital. I was terrified the nurse might be right. When I got home, I took a sleeping pill. I needed to completely shut down. The next day, I called my boss and I told him I wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be coming in. I instead called my mom to tell her what was going on. She was in Toluca and immediately told me to come home, saying no job or internship was worth my life. She told me I could try again next year. After we hung up, I thought about it for a while. I needed to make a decision before the day ended. As always, I rolled a die to help me decide. Even numbers meant quit, and odd numbers meant stay. When I rolled it, it landed on one of its edges. Panic surged through me. I jumped off the couch, unable to believe what was happening. I grabbed my things and left my apartment, thinking I would feel better if I blended in with the crowd. After walking for hours, I decided to quit my internship and go back to Toluca. I sent a message to my boss simply saying that I wouldn't be returning to work and that I was going back to Toluca. Then, I called my mom and told her the same thing. I went back to my apartment, packed everything I could, and left for the bus station. I was standing in line to buy my ticket when I noticed a woman in front of me holding her son's hand. The boy looked about 6 years old. He turned to look at me, and his face was disfigured. He looked me in the eye and said, "You can't run away." Without being able to control myself, I let out a scream. The boy's mother looked at me with disgust, and when I looked back at the boy, he appeared normal. His face was fine. I thought I was paranoid after everything that had happened. I left the line and went to the bathroom to splash water on my face. When I returned, the woman and her son were gone. I bought my ticket and called my mom to distract myself while I waited for the bus. I didn't tell her what I had seen, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Instead, we talked about unimportant things, childhood memories, and the like. Finally, they announced that my bus was leaving. I told my mom I was going to take another sleeping pill and that I would see her at the bus terminal in Toluca. That's exactly what I did. I soon fell asleep. I was jolted awake by a violent shake. Before I could react, I felt myself being thrown around, hitting the bus walls. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my abdomen. Everything went still. We had overturned. I could see the chaos, bodies and luggage scattered all over the bus. I couldn't move. I was still half asleep from the pill and was weak, with the pain in my abdomen growing worse. I passed out. While unconscious, I saw one of the children. We were alone in the middle of nowhere and everything was white. He took my hand and said it was time. I told him I didn't want to go. I still had so much to do. I asked him what had happened to him and why he was doing this. He told me that many years ago, the hospital had been an orphanage. One night, something happened and the place caught fire. Everyone was trapped and they burned to death. But all they wanted was to cross over and be free. At that moment, the light began to expand and I woke up. I was in a hospital and a nurse was looking at me holding a defibrillator. I was alive. The nurse must have given me a sedative because I soon fell asleep again. After spending several days in the ICU, I learned that the sharp pain in my abdomen had been caused by a metal rod that had pierced through me during the bus accident. When the rescue teams arrived, many people had already died. They told me that what saved me was taking the sleeping pill, as being semi-conscious allowed my body to focus on my vital functions and keep me alive longer. I still think it was a miracle. When I finally got home, I did some research on the orphanage fire. It was something that kept haunting my mind. I wanted to help those children cross over. The fire was caused by a short circuit. The orphanage's door handles had recently been replaced with a low-quality material that melted in the fire, trapping everyone inside. 25 children and 4 adults died in that blaze. It was a tragedy. But apparently, it was a poorly reported event. Nobody cared about a group of orphans. Once I had fully recovered, I returned to the hospital and brought a priest with me, just as a taxi driver had suggested. When the next semester started, I returned to the same hospital to redo my internship, and the apparitions had stopped. Since I was very young, I have traveled a lot. My parents love visiting and discovering new places, meeting new people, trying new dishes, and learning as much as they can about the world. Both of them became successful researchers. My mother is a well-known sociologist in the academic community, and my father also dedicated many years to science in the field of international relations. They both traveled extensively around the world before deciding to have me. Apparently, they took advantage of many scholarships and programs that allowed them to travel during their student years. Their love story is worthy of any Sofia Coppola movie. As they often tell me, they met on a trip they took to Tokyo, Japan, in a way very similar to Lost in Translation. Both of them were staying in the city. They didn't know each other because they were studying different disciplines, but they met in a restaurant. Apparently, my mother was having trouble ordering, and my father approached to help her when he noticed she was a foreigner just like him. After introducing themselves, my father suggested they should share a table, and although my mother was a bit embarrassed, she was also happy to share a meal with someone who spoke her language. So, she accepted. It's no surprise that the Japanese are polite, but they tend to be quite reserved and solitary in public spaces. They had dinner, talked, got to know each other, and of course, they fell in love. They spent the rest of their stay going out whenever their responsibilities allowed them, and when it was time to return to Mexico, they agreed to meet in Mexico City, since my mother was from Jalisco and my father from Puebla. They dated for a few months, meeting whenever they could, but eventually, the distance became unbearable, and they agreed to live together in a place where they could quickly travel to their hometowns if needed. What other place fulfilled that requirement better than the capital of the country? Both of them found jobs in the city. They lived together for many years, coordinating their vacations to travel both within country and abroad. Tokyo became a special destination for them since it was where their love story began. They visited it a few more times and took the opportunity to explore other destinations in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. They were both quite fortunate, as their salaries and jobs allowed them to live a very comfortable life. Money rarely posed a problem for their plans and projects, and as the saying goes, when you have a personal and financial stability, you start thinking about having a child. After solidifying their professional careers and securing some assets, they decided to have a child. I was born, and after the recovery period, I was already traveling to visit my mother's family in Jalisco and my father's in Puebla. My parents' lives changed a little because while I wasn't yet attending school, they still enjoyed the freedom to travel. Even though it's true that babies don't remember much, there are plenty of photographs and stories from that period that my parents recall fondly. Though I barely remember it, it fills me with joy to see how eloquently both of them tell those stories. When I started school, our travel time became limited, so long trips were no longer feasible. They only took advantage of vacation periods to take me to different destinations. Still, during that time, they could never take me to Tokyo, even though they often talked about how amazing and futuristic the city was. I could only imagine that place from the photos my parents kept so lovingly. Back then, the internet wasn't as developed as it is today, with countless people creating travel content. Yes, there was information about anything you could imagine, but it wasn't as accessible. But hearing my parents talk about the wonders of Japan throughout my childhood and adolescence only fueled my fascination and love for a place that only existed in my imagination because I had never set foot on that island. I became interested in, and even obsessed with, Japan to the point that, starting in middle school, I asked my parents to send me to a school to learn the language. They didn't overlook my request and enrolled me in some courses, which I attended after school. I learned as much as I could about the language and customs, which only heightened my expectations of the country. I never asked my parents to take me on a trip to Tokyo because deep down, I wanted it to be something I could do on my own one day. I wanted to uncover everything I could about that place before sharing it with my parents, who would surely be delighted to return to the land that held such fond memories for them. But would it be the same for me? Well, that's an answer I would eventually discover, and it wasn't quite like the one my parents had found. Practically all of middle and high school, I lived obsessed with the country. I spent my time researching different aspects of Japan, and my conversations always revolved around the same topic. I'm sure my friends got tired of me talking about it over and over, though most of them listened intently to what I had discovered. Others, however, did grow weary of my little obsession. By the time I was in high school, I had a decent grasp of the language, though not at an advanced level because it's truly a complex language full of nuances. But I was confident I could at least order food and understand what subway station I was in, since from what I've heard, the best way to get around the city is by train. In the end, I had been preparing for a trip that might never happen, but the thought alone filled me with excitement and enthusiasm. When I finished high school, my parents offered me a trip to Japan as a graduation gift, and honestly, I wasn't expecting it. I had spent years fantasizing about that dream trip, but when the opportunity finally presented itself, I didn't take it. I suppose it was because I felt in some way that I didn't deserve such an opportunity. I felt like I hadn't earned such a reward, and besides, I had promised myself I would take that trip on my own dime. So, although it pained me to reject the gift at the time, my parents understood my feelings and respected them. I think they should have insisted more, and I could have been less proud and more humble because, in the end, all those years of studying the language and its culture didn't help me when I finally got the chance to take that fateful trip. At the end of the day, language books tell you a lot about syntax, spelling, and pronunciation, but they don't always explain things that defy logic. History books can be a great starting point to understand the political, military, and economic context of the country. They give a glimpse into the Japanese values of honor and sacrifice. But despite knowing a lot about the country, the truth is that I only knew a fraction of everything. There will always be things you won't find in books, articles, or reports. Some events are so significant that they can't be drowned out by the flood of news that fills the airwaves every day, such as the sarin gas attacks in the Tokyo subways in the mid-90s by the Shinrikyo cult. While the attack was aimed at the government and police, it ended up affecting civilians. If I remember correctly, 13 people were killed and over 50 others were injured. Shoko Ashihara's distorted vision led his followers to carry out various attacks that claimed many lives. Of course, this incident received widespread media coverage. No international or national media outlet missed the chance to flood their programming with reports, investigations, and analysis that shaped public's opinion for all the viewers who relied on these trustworthy news channels. When I heard the news, I was shocked. It was a harsh dose of reality. I mean, horrible and terrible things happen everywhere. In my country, violent news stories have become part of everyday life for millions of people. But it was jarring to realize that even in the most magical places, such things happen. It was something I had always known, but idealization often makes us ignore these truths to preserve the pristine image of a place or person. It was particularly shocking at the time because a family friend of my parents had recently been violently murdered by one of their sons during one of his psychotic episodes. The boy had been struggling and was undergoing treatment. He had lived a relatively normal life. In fact, we had gone to elementary school together, but it seemed that the boy had started using some experimental drugs to treat his condition as part of a pharmaceutical trial. Not much was revealed about it, and I firmly believe everything was done to divert public attention away from the pharmaceutical company and focus on the boy's problems. The news had deeply affected my parents and even me, as I had known the boy, who was now being tried for the murder of his own parents. The blame was placed primarily on the drugs, leaving the pharmaceutical company's role in the experimental treatment largely ignored. In those moments, I had no choice but to focus on my studies and try to distract myself to avoid sinking into despair. Learning about the attack was deeply unsettling for me. At home, my father couldn't stop talking about the case of my former classmate. Some of my teachers even used it as an example to show us the dangers of drug use. Meanwhile, my dream destination was also in chaos due to the attacks on the trains by the Shinrikyo cult, who were convinced that the end of the world was near, brought on by a third world war fought with nuclear weapons, which would put an end to all the world's sins and crimes. After a few weeks, the attack was no longer newsworthy, and people stopped talking about it. My parents also stopped discussing the situation with my former classmate after he was sentenced to prison. Everything that had happened became part of history and the daily routine of life. We all became spectators of the overwhelming amount of violent news that flooded all kinds of media outlets. To some extent, the public became so saturated with tragic stories that they started to get bored of hearing about them. Audiences grew desensitized to these kind of reports. At that time, I was in the final year of my degree. I had decided to study international trade, and my research focused on studying trade relations with Japan. I was awarded a scholarship to spend a semester in Tokyo due to my academic performance and because I spoke a bit of the language. So, without hesitation, I accepted the scholarship and began preparing for my trip. I told my parents, who were thrilled about the opportunity that had come my way. When the departure date arrived, I couldn't sleep all night. The flight was early, and the excitement and fear of traveling alone to the other side of the world kept me awake. My parents woke up first thing in the morning and got ready to take me to the airport. The flight wasn't delayed, and the immigration process was quite easy because I was traveling as a student. I said goodbye to both of them and boarded the plane. Little did I know that it would be the last time I would ever see them. Arriving in Japan was incredible. You could already feel the cultural shift from the moment you stepped into the airport. Most processes were automated, so there was little bureaucracy, at least for entering the country. The rest of the paperwork, however, was a nightmare. I was in awe of everything I saw. The city was enormous, the buildings towering, the streets were clean, and everything was very orderly. But one thing was clear: the crowding was a nightmare. Tokyo is one of the most populated cities in the world, and that overpopulation is evident. One thing that initially struck me as wonderful was how indifferent the Japanese were to others. Few people feel judged by the locals in the city. Everyone is too busy living their lives to pay attention to what's happening around them. It almost feels like they live isolated and alienated from the rest of the world. It's no wonder there are high rates of depression and isolation among the millions of Japanese who prefer to end their lives inside their tiny apartments, only for their absence to be noticed days, weeks, or even months later. As I got to know more about the inner workings of Japan, I started to feel a bit disillusioned. At least at the university, I met other international students who were also on exchange programs. We shared the same perspective on how difficult it is for a foreigner to fit into the everyday logic and routines of the Japanese. They would never kick you out of a business unless you caused trouble, nor would they treat you poorly. If you had a question, most people would try to help or direct you to someone who could. At the university, it was relatively easier to talk to some of the Japanese students since we shared classes and spaces. I managed to form a small group of friends consisting of both foreigners and locals with whom I would go out to eat or visit attractions. They showed me different parts of the city and gave me recommendations to make my stay more enjoyable, which I greatly appreciated. But many people are good at hiding their true intentions. A few months after I had arrived in Japan, I was trying to blend in with the locals. My relatives contacted me to inform me that my parents had died in a car accident while traveling to Jalisco to visit my grandmother, who had become seriously ill due to her diabetes and hypertension. I hadn't expected to receive such a life-shattering piece of news while I was living my dreams of visiting the city where my parents had met. They offered to cover the expenses to bring me back to Mexico so I could attend the funeral. But when I spoke to my coordinators and advisors, they told me that leaving would mean losing my scholarship and the semester. At that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted to say goodbye to my parents, no matter what. The arrangements were made for me to return 8 days after their deaths. I couldn't get flights any earlier due to various issues and threats that the cult had made against the airports, so I had to wait a week. I used that time to say goodbye to the friends I had made among the other students, including one Japanese friend who suggested we go to a bar as a farewell. Since it would be difficult for me to return anytime soon and everyone's exchange program was ending in a few weeks, it seemed like a nice gesture. At first, I wasn't in the mood for something like that, but I also couldn't just stay in my room crying all the time. Once I returned to Mexico, I would hardly have a moment to breathe, as I would be dealing with everything that comes with loss. So I pushed myself to accept the invitation. We agreed to meet in the city center and head to a traditional Japanese bar. We arrived at the agreed upon time and made our way to the place our friend had recommended. The bar was quite far from Tokyo. I'm not sure where exactly, as I had never visited that area before. To our surprise, it was a very pleasant and traditional place, just as our friend had promised. We had a great time, though at some point, I couldn't help but feel guilty for enjoying myself while my parents' bodies were lying in cold coffins. In the middle of the celebration, I couldn't hold back my tears, and although they insisted that I hadn't ruined the farewell, I knew they were just being kind. I shouldn't have gone. After we had eaten, drank, and sang, we were all exhausted. I had only drunk moderately because otherwise I would have had a complete breakdown. I didn't want to be a burden to anyone, so I made sure to stay responsible. Some of my friends still wanted to continue the night out, but they wanted to go dancing in Tokyo. I just wanted to go home and rest, so I didn't join them. They called a taxi and left. I stayed with my Japanese friend, offering to take care of him until we returned to the city, as he was quite drunk. I had never seen him like that, so I was a bit worried. The bartender called us a taxi, and we both got in. My friend got in first, while I went to the bathroom. When I returned, I climbed into the back seat of the car. It was quite late, and I didn't know the area, so I had no choice but to trust the taxi driver. After a while, I noticed that we weren't heading towards the bright city. Instead, we were moving further away, and the only thing dominating the landscape was a vast forest. I thought the driver had made a mistake or simply taken an alternative route. My friend was asleep in the seat next to me, so I tried to stay calm. Suddenly, my friend woke up. He tried to get his bearings and asked the driver to stop. The car pulled over to the side of the road, and my friend opened the door and ran into the forest. I thought he might need to throw up, but minutes passed and he didn't return. I started to worry. Maybe he had fallen or had an accident. After all, it was nighttime and there wasn't much light in the area except for the taxi's headlights and the flashing red taillights. I asked the driver to wait for us and ventured into the forest to follow my friend's trail. After walking and searching for a few minutes, I noticed a small cabin in the middle of the forest. I could see a faint light in the distance, so I headed toward the house to ask about my friend or seek help to find him since my bag, with all my belongings, was still in the taxi. As I approached the house, I noticed that the light coming from inside was turning redder and redder. When I finally stood in front of the door, an irrational fear gripped me. I decided to peek through the keyhole to see if anyone was inside and to try to figure out the source of the red light. Through the keyhole, all I could see was a room bathed in an unbearable shade of red. The furniture, some paintings on the walls themselves, and the floor, everything was red. Suddenly, a sphere began to grow and shrink until it fixed its gaze on me. It was the pupil of someone or something on the other side of the room, watching me just as I was watching through the keyhole. We were both staring at each other through the other's eyes. When I realized what was happening, I stumbled back. I ran back to the road where, fortunately, the taxi was still waiting. I jumped in and told the driver to leave. He obliged, and we sped away. As we were leaving the area, I realized we were in Aokigahara, the infamous suicide forest where many people go to end their lives. The taxi driver took me to the police station, where they took my statement, ran a drug test, and asked me various questions. They detained me, despite my explaining that I was just a student coming from a night out and that I needed to return to my country. Of course, they didn't listen. They threw me in a cell, and days later, they declared me mentally unstable and suffering from alcoholism. I tried to appeal the decision, but all I achieved was being transferred to a psychiatric facility because no one could corroborate anything I had told them about my parents, my life, or my friends. In this place, they keep me drugged and sedated most of the time. I can't even eat or go to the bathroom by myself without two men in white coats holding me up to wipe the drool off my chin, forcing me to swallow liquefied food. I take advantage of the moments when we're allowed to do recreational activities to write down my memories, hiding a pencil and paper in my clothes.